Hello everyone, I am Brian Easton, the author of the autobiography of a Werewolf Hunter series, and this is Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. Welcome back to the Werewolf Bar for your May edition of Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. I hope you're enjoying the spring, whatever that looks like where you are. Around here, it's a lot of rain combined with some cool evenings, warming days, all revving up for the summer months, which start all too soon for my liking. But we've got other things to discuss than the weather. And not the least of which is to tell you that we finally have a release date for the Winter Fox Journal's Book 2 audiobook. And that date is May 28th. So in just about 2 weeks, it will be available at spokenrealms.com. And you can find the link in the description below. At first, it will be, as I understand it, only available on Spoken Realms, but will eventually drift into the Amazon page as well. Now, we've waited a long time for this to come about 9 months, in fact. With long periods of waiting, more setbacks, and more waiting. So Basil, Sands, and I are beyond happy to finally have a set date for the release. Let me also briefly mention The Legends of the Werewolf Hunter, Book 2, the anthology, which is rooted in my novels. Now, the book has been completed for a while. We tried to do a Kickstarter campaign last month, which didn't go as well as we thought it would. And so we're hoping to be publishing this directly through Amazon. And I expect we'll have that up and available for you by this time in June. Now, you may remember me mentioning something about the Werewolf Bar transitioning to a different and more permanent set. I think we talked about this before, but maybe not. Either way, we're working on getting Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter some new digs and into a different format than what we have been doing for the last few years. The idea is pretty simple. Instead of bringing you one long episode once a month like we have been, we want to bring you a weekly episode of a much shorter duration and covering different topics. For instance, if Amanda Rogers had a question for us on Amanda Asks, then that whole show could be based on that question. The same holds true for Tex's Tools of the Trade and Doc Talk Shop. We're also planning on getting into things like werewolf movies and horror movies in general, reviews and critiques and things like that, and going over different things that are happening in the world as it pertains to monster, some folklore and legend discussions. And we're also going to do something every quarter called the Monster Hunter Quarterly magazine. So in January, April, July, and October, at the beginning of every quarter, we'll have Monster Hunter Quarterly. Now, this is a magazine, or a periodical as it was known when it first debuted in 1890, a professional journal for monster hunters. The magazine was in publication for 2 quarters shy of 100 years. Its first issue in July of 1890, and its final appearance, a centennial edition, in January of 1990. So with almost 400 issues to its name and profiles on different monster hunters, tips and tricks of the trade, interviews and atlases, news from the field, as well as sightings, editorials, and all sorts of other entries, we have a wealth of information to draw from and plan to present some of that to you each quarter once we get Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter into its brand new format. So we're looking forward to that. But Monster Hunter Quarterly is not just something we're going to air 4 times a year on the show. It's also something we can bring you visually, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that right now. So I hope that piques your interest and gets you thinking about what's possible with this idea, and we'll have more to say about it down the road. And speaking of changing things up, I wanted to share something with you that you may have heard me talk about before, but to my recollection, I never have spoke at length on it. And that is at the same time I created Sylvester James many, many years ago when the earth was young, I also created a vampire slayer by the name of Sonny Carol. Now, I never did much with Sonny, and that's mainly because the world of vampire killers was already well stocked at the time I created him and has become even more crowded since. And so I figured the world didn't need another vampire slayer, but it was in dire need of a werewolf hunter, and so I put my creative energies behind Sylvester. But Sonny was always in the back of my mind, kind of waiting for his time. And I don't know that that time has come, although I have been fleshing him out fairly recently, and I figured it was as good a time as any to share with you a little of Sonny Carol's bio. And I have it here. He was born Anthony Julian Carroll, but his father called him Sonny. In the time of his grandfathers, his Welsh family had been a predominant name in London, though he didn't know why or what had happened since that had changed it. He was only 10 years old when his parents disappeared without a trace, and he was sent to America to live with his great-uncle Silas in Texas. Uncle Silas taught him how to use his wits, as well as his fists, and a family heirloom Winchester rifle, model of 1892. But growing up, Sonny was visited by recurring dreams of his lost parents, which he took as visitations from them, presenting him a mystery only he could solve. Whether real or imagined, the dreams and the puzzle they contained became a fascination that took him down many curious paths of learning. When he came of age, Uncle Silas enrolled him in the university, where he studied anthropology, medicine, and forensic science, all surpassing the expectations of his professors. He was awarded a doctorate in forensic anthropology the year he turned 21. In his persistent quest to divine from his dreams the fate of his parents, he also became an authority on certain types of folklore, as well as the practice of hematophagy, or the eating of blood. This research introduced him to the obscure field of clinical vampirism, which in turn revealed to him the existence of true vampires, a discovery which put him in danger as he had reached a reality from which there was no going back. The undead had taken note of him, especially an ancient creature named Santiago de Valdez, who had allegedly been haunting Texas since the time of Silas's grandfather. Having narrowly survived a brief confrontation with this particularly dangerous vampire, Sonny was left with little choice but to arm himself for more, and took counsel from his uncle, whose mother's maiden name had been Morris. Only then did great-uncle Silas tell him of his heritage and how his family, once wealthy and prominent, had changed its name to Carroll from Westenra. And that's Sonny Carol. You can see the obvious similarities in the origin stories between Sonny and Sylvester, and you can chalk that up to them both being created at the same time when I was just 10 years old or so. I could change the background story, of course, but I'm sentimental about it, and I don't like to mess with memories. I mean, there's not a lot left from when I was 10. And by the way, if you didn't catch it, the picture of Sonny, which I showed at the beginning with the Winchester rifle I mentioned, belonged to his great-grandfather, Quincy Morris. And its name, incidentally, is Memento Mori. One of the reasons that I bring up this tonight is because Dr. T. Broussard is here with us to talk about vampires. Now, it may seem odd to talk about vampires on a show about a werewolf hunter, especially since vampires have been covered ad infinitum in popular culture. But that does not diminish the effect that they have on our culture, and it doesn't make them any less interesting. And it doesn't in any way demean their importance as a monster. And since we're interested in hunting monsters, in general, as well as werewolves, it's always a good idea to know about your prey and how quickly the role from prey to predator can change. Without further ado, here is Dr. T. Broussard with Doc Talks Shop.
Hello, and welcome to Doc Talk Shop with Whiskey with the Werewolf Hunter. Tonight is a very special podcast, you might call it. This is all about vampires. Now, when I say the word vampire, I'm speaking of three distinct things: the vampire folklore, the vampire media, and those occultists and so forth that practice different aspects of vampirism as a part of their magical and spiritual practices. The vampire folklore goes all the way back to ancient Sumer. The idea is that one group of gods took the spirit and the blood of other groups of gods, and one of those spirits, called the Akaru, wanted its blood and spirit back, and so it attempts to take it from man, which inherited both of those qualities through theft, essentially. That is the oldest vampire figure. It even predates Lilith from Semitic sources. In fact, it's very likely that Lilith is a feminine manifestation of the Sumerian Akaru. Now, the vampire folklore moved from the Fertile Crescent into Asia, and that's where you get, for example, the Chinese Zhang Shi, loosely translated as leaping corpse, and they drain life force, they drain Qi, as in blood, but the principle is the same. You have a reanimated corpse that is draining life in order to sustain its unlife or its other kind of life. And eventually the Asian lore moved through what we would now call Turkey and took root in Eastern Europe, and it's in Eastern Europe that the Upir developed. And among the Upir, you can find the Strigoi, which have the same full range of powers that we associate with Dracula, for example, shape-shifting, mind control, and so forth. That's because the Strigoi is a kind of witch. And as an interesting side note, the Strigoi in life often was a werewolf. So you have the immediate conflation in the older lore between the werewolf and the vampire. You do not have them at odds with each other at all. You have them two different phases of a single existence. You have the werewolf in life who rises from death as a vampire and retaining the full range of shape-shifting powers and other things. Now, with Strigoi, you have the connection between the vampire, the werewolf, and the witches. Beside the Strigoi, you also have the Nosferatu. And the Nosferatu are monstrous vampires. They are what you see in the movie Nosferatu. Uh, these are overtly monstrous creatures. They were monsters in life and only became more so in death. They look very much like a combination of a rat and a reptile. They're very overtly corpse-like, and they are credited, interestingly enough, for being one of the breeds that can reproduce with living women or men. That's important because in Eastern European sources, Upir are more of a race of people than they are simply the dead partially resurrected by demonic means. That comes later in the mythology. Now, besides the Strigoi and the Nosferatu, you have the incubi, succubi, and these are sexual types. These are people that they use their sexuality to get close to their victims, and through the acts of sex, drain people of blood or life force or their vital essences. Uh, these are very much connected with the legend of Lilith and how, very akin to demons. Now, with them, you have connections to things like decadent living, and a lot of the things that we associate with vampires today come out of this incubi, succubi range of the mythology. You see a lot of that in like media, like Interview with the Vampire and so on. Now, you also see a lot of the next type, which is the Revenant. The Revenant is a corpse that has been resurrected by various means to be a vampire. They typically have great mental power and great physical strength, but few other supernatural abilities. This is very much the type of vampire that was played by Christopher Lee in his Dracula movies. Now, with those four types being gone over, let's first address the media of the vampire by saying this. You can find an example of Dracula that covers each of these four types of Upir. Now, I say the word Upir because Upir, plural Upirshi, is the original Eastern European word that has some ties to Turkish that was used for this group of beings. The word vampire refers to essentially a kind of alcoholic. It is one that drinks, drinks life in this case. And so that's become the term in the English language for this type of being. Now, that's important because as names change, as words evolve, mythology changes. Now, the vampire fiction is very malleable. It's been used as a metaphor for everything from a demon lover to shades of the Antichrist and religion. Many of the incarnations of Dracula have represented the Antichrist in various literature and forms and other media. Now, you have to separate the character of Count Dracula or Dracula the Vampire from Vlad Tepes, the 15th century Transylvanian warlord that Stoker based the background of his Dracula on. Vlad Tepes was a Transylvanian hero. He was a hero for the church. He fought the Turks at a time when the Turks and so forth, the Muslims, were seen as the army of the Antichrist. I'm not saying they are that. I'm saying that's how they were seen at the time. And so when we think, now in modern media, there's a lot of conflation between Dracula and Vlad Tepes. Um, that's a new phenomenon, and it's done more as an homage to Stoker than to the historical data that we have, officially speaking. Besides Tepes, in terms of historical vampires, which I would not put him in that category, by the way, you have people like Elizabeth Bathory, who could be described as someone that practiced magical or occult vampirism as well as cannibalism. It's interesting because depending on which source you're looking at, she's either described as a vampire or a werewolf. And in fiction, they have really played up a sexual angle with her, and she's become the embodiment of the succubus type of vampire. We're leaning heavily on the connection between the female vampire and lesbianism. Now, whether or not that's historically accurate is a matter of debate among historians. There is evidence that she practiced the occult. There is evidence that she was, in historical terms, a heretic. It's debatable how many victims she actually had or how much evidence was trumped up against her. Continuing on this theme, we have Gilles de Rais. Gilles de Rais was a marshal of France. He was a ruler in the southwest of France, interestingly, from where my family originated in France. Uh, he was the companion and protector of Joan of Arc. He became interested in the occult early in life, and after the death of Jean, he, according to accounts, took up the practice of necromancy and alchemy and performed vampirism, they claim, on children, although there's no real evidence for this beside what was acquired from torture. And interestingly, he was exonerated by the church centuries later, much like Joan herself was exonerated by the church. So, bully for them, a bit too late, in my opinion. All that aside, since we're on the topic of the vampire in fiction, I'd like to say this point blank. Much of what we now think of as the vampire in media, vampire in fiction, this idea of a war between vampires, the idea that vampires don't shapeshift, that's only about 25, 30 years old. In the older stories, in the older lore, vampires were shapeshifting all over the place, and there was no conflict between vampires and werewolves. They were often two phases of the same life cycle. Like I said earlier, the werewolf in life rises to the vampire in death. And interestingly, Brian Peaston references some of this in his modern mythology. And this is a personal sticking point. I do not consider the sparkly beings of Twilight any kind of vampire. And the kind of werewolf they describe in Twilight is a very much a lesser breed, I would say. Although at least they have some basis in folklore, which the other ones I cannot associate with anything. It is through fiction and media that the vampire has morphed away from folklore and occult practice to being a metaphor and archetype for all kinds of things, ranging from alternative lifestyles to alcoholism and drug addiction, different types of psychopathy. All of these things have been metaphorically explored through vampirism. So if you have a disenfranchised group out there, there's probably some bit of media that uses a vampire to explain them that point of view. Now, it is only in recent years, since the mid 60s, that the vampire has become a heroic figure. And now you're hard pressed to find a vampire in fiction that is not a heroic figure to some degree or a tragic figure. The Byronic vampire that was really began with Barnabas Collins. It was Barnabas Collins in Dark Shadows, rest in power, Jonathan Frid, who brought that idea forward, and it was that character that in fact inspired Anne Rice to do her interview with the vampire idea. There is actually a plot line in Dark Shadows in which Barnabas Collins is held captive by a character who forcibly interviews him so that the character can write a book about Barnabas Collins. So there is your original interview with the vampire, and it's Dark Shadows, not Anne Rice. Anne Rice, in her mythology, in her fiction, I should say, leaned heavily on three things: the Sumerian lore, and she combined the Revenant type of vampire and the Incubus type of vampire. For her, those three things became one and produced her vampire. Yeah. Her vampire has become a big metaphor in several alternative lifestyles. And so we have, lifestyle imitating fiction and vice versa. They go together. Now, because the vampire is such a big archetype in fiction, and it's often connected with addiction models and things like that, a lot of modern characters will struggle with their vampirism the way people will struggle with, say, addiction or any other sorts of issues like that. I don't particularly like that model because why would you connect addiction with something that makes you more powerful? If I were going to liken vampires of fiction having an issue, I would say that a vampire that wants to be human again has an eating disorder. Because if you starve yourself, you're going to have weakness, hallucinations, and death. You're not going to become a different type of being. Once you become a vampire, you're a vampire. So there. That's my take on all that. With the vampire folklore and media going over generally, I want to now come to a more grounded third category, and that is people who pursue the vampire as a lifestyle, goths mostly, people who pursue some type of vampirism as a magical practice, and finally those that pursue vampirism of various kinds as an expression of psychopathy, essentially. With people in the lifestyle, those can be grouped into those that like the archetype, and so they dress up that way on the weekends. and they tend to live at night and things like that. And they're your average fun-loving people. They just have a bent toward looking a certain way and behaving a certain way, and it's no different than, say, people who cosplay Star Trek or Star Wars. Then you have people who actively pursue vampirism. They will even take blood from donors and things like that as part of an occult practice or spiritual practice to extend their lives and promote health and so forth for themselves. Of those, we have two types. One type uses donors and is sincere practitioners of different kinds of magic, and the other kind are delusional criminals that have made the news because of the things that they've done. And it's from this type that you get legends about Jill DeRay and Elizabeth Bathory and things like that. For the most part, those that pursue vampirism as a spiritual or magical practice will not do things that will expose themselves to the public or anything like that. And I've never met a self-professed vampire who crumbled in the dust or caught fire in the sunlight or anything like that. Most will not even claim that. They pursue a certain lifestyle and they conduct themselves safely and with non-criminal acts. Some of those will be gods, some will not. There are some self-proclaimed vampires that if you met them, you would never know what they were because they keep their private lives private. Because there is a move in fiction of late to whitewash and romanticize everything. Many vampires in fiction lack a lot of the characteristics, so much so that you really can't connect them to the creature of folklore. A notable exception to that are the films put out by Film and Pictures, the subspecies films, and Vampire Eternals. 6 films in all. They're made in Romania. They are made by people that are aware of the folklore, and they're made by people that care about bringing the folklore of the vampire back to the media. And in full disclosure, I am friends with some of the people involved in those films. So, yes, I am biased, but I would say that even though I wasn't biased, those films give you much more of the vampire folklore than a lot of the other stuff. In other movies like Underworld, you have a more sci-fi type vampire with no connection to the folklore at all. So with that being said, when you discuss the vampire, it's important to know what you mean by vampire and what form that takes and what it's, because it's like saying Protestant. Well, what kind of Protestant? Same thing with the vampire. I will also say that for some that practice vampirism as a spiritual or magical practice, the term vampire itself is avoided and, in fact, is seen as a vulgarism not to be used. So if you meet any people in the lifestyle who don't call themselves vampires, I wouldn't use that term around them. You might end up in a bad position. Now, in regards to historical vampires, there's one I'd like to mention, and that's the vampire Saint-Germain from New Orleans, known in the early jazz age. He was thought to live in a house on Ursuline and Royal, and many believe that he had some connection to the alchemist, the Count of Saint Germain. So there is that. So with all that being said, mind the moon, watch your necks, and good night.
So vampires, the variety of them are like a variety of Protestants, right? I love that. If being a Protestant only differentiates you from a Catholic, just like being a Gentile only differentiates you from being a non-Jew. So very interesting stuff. And one of the reasons why I asked Doc to chat with us about vampires tonight is because I get the feeling sometimes I might come off as someone who doesn't like vampires as characters. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, Dracula remains one of my favorite stories, and the characters in it some of my favorite monster hunters in all of fiction. I also enjoyed Anne Rice's original series, which Doc talked about, and of course Barnabas Collins from Dark Shadows, which he mentioned. So the fact that I find them overdone in books and overrepresented in movies doesn't mean I have no use for them, as I think my latest book will attest. So thank you, Dr. T, for taking the time to share your knowledge with us tonight and your insights. A pleasure and a privilege as always to have him on the show. It's a short show tonight, hopefully indicative of a format that will be coming to you weekly, not monthly, in the not too distant future. In the meantime, you can find me on the web at werewolfhunter.com. Drop me an email at brian@werewolfhunter.com. All our links, including Facebook and Amazon, are in the description below. Thanks for stopping by the bar tonight, and until we see you next month, happy hunting and mind the moon.